Hello everyone! I hope you've been enjoying my coverage of the World Rapid Championship so far. After that long and brilliant endgame between Vladimir Fedoseev and Magnus Carlsen, we have a wild game between Alexander Grischuk and Safarli Eltaj, or maybe it's Eltaj, I don't know. He's a grandmaster from Azerbaijan, a very strong player. He won the Azerbaijan Championship twice in 2010 and 2016. He was also the under-10 world champion in 2002. And this game, this is a game from round 13, and Grischuk shows us that no matter what, he will always be considered amongst the world elite. So, Grischuk has the white pieces and he opens with knight to f3, the ready opening. We have c5 and c4, transposing into the English, knight to c6, knight to c3, and g6. e3 by Grischuk, knight to f6, d4, c captures, e captures, and d5. C captures on d5, knight captures on d5, and queen to b3, attacking twice the knight on d5. We have e6, defending the knight, and the bishop to b5. Bishop to g7, bishop captures, pawn captures bishop, and now kingside castle by Grischuk. Castle by Safarli, and we have knight to a4. Preparing to move the knight to c5, this would be an excellent square for the knight. Queen to d6, rook to e1 now, and rook to b8 with a tempo on the queen. Queen back to d1 and knight to e7. We have bishop to d2, knight to f5, and bishop to c3, now defending the d4 pawn. Rook to d8, and we have knight to c5, and this comes with a little trick. Safarli plays knight captures, we have knight to e4 now, attacking the queen. Queen to d5, and now comes knight captures on d4, bishop captures on d4, and queen to a4. And what's the idea behind queen to a4? Grischuk is inviting Safarli to capture the bishop on c3. For example, after bishop captures, b captures, now you have, after exchanging the dark square bishop, you have a lot of dark square weaknesses around your king, and there's an immediate threat of knight to f6, forking the king and the queen. So after black defends against this, for example, queen to e5, now you capture the a7 pawn, you win back the pawn, and it's a better position for white. So after this queen to a4 move, Safarli plays queen to b5, getting the queen out of the way, so and also offers the exchange of queens. He just grabbed a pawn, and here we have the Grischuk move. He plays queen captures on d4, and queen captures on d4, this queen sacrifice is actually the best move for white. Rook captures queen, bishop captures queen, and we have f5. Knight to f6 check, king to f7, knight captures on h7, c5, and bishop to c3. And if you look at this position now, white doesn't really have compensation in material sense, but if you look at this strong diagonal this bishop is currently on from c3, he's protecting the b2 pawn. You can never attack this dark square bishop, as you have a light square bishop, you have a rook and a queen, so and plus you have a c pawn and the a pawn. You don't have a b pawn or a d pawn to attack the bishop. So this bishop, it can stay on c3 for as long as it likes. Plus, white Grischuk has nice double rooks. This knight can always jump to g4, g5, be supported with h4. So basically, it's a much better position for white. And additionally, Safarli has a light square bishop, and this is practically useless in this position. So rook to b7, preparing to bring the rook into the game, maybe via rook d7, rook to e3. We have rook to e7 now, and knight to g5. King goes to e8, and we have rook 8 to e1. Grischuk doubles up on the e file and piles up on that e6 pawn. We have e5 by Safarli, and now comes bishop captures. Bishop to b7, now the light square bishop did become activated. a3 now, king to d7, and f3. Not allowing any future ideas with queen to c6, maybe threatening some checkmate on g2. King to c8, and we have knight to h3, queen a4, and b4 now. And b4 is a bold move. Grischuk was low on time pretty much the entire game, but very soon both of the players will play. The last 20 moves of the game were played like both of them had 10 seconds on the clock, so it was really intense. And here actually capturing c captures on b4 is perfectly fine for black, but in such a time trouble you have to see what happens after rook to c1 check. The bishop is slicing all the way here, the king can't move, the rook is now covering the c file, the other rook is coming maybe to d file. So after something like king d7, you capture the pawn, queen captures, and rook to c8. King goes here, rook captures, queen b1 check, king f2, now king captures. It's a playable position. Black is actually doing okay here. The a pawn could prove to be decisive here. But you know, it's in serious time trouble. It's very hard to open up a file that goes all the way to your king. So c4 is played, and okay, black has now created a passed pawn. Knight to f2. We have g5, h3, f4, attacking the rook. Rook to c3, now blocking the passed pawn. Bishop to d5, knight to g4. We have king to b7, king to h2, queen to c6, and now rook to d1. Queen goes here, and this is actually the move that, I mean, it's very hard for black to actually figure out any sort of plan here. Probably a move like a5 would be best, break up white's pawn structure here, and it's very hard to see if white could make any progress after that. But here, Safarli played queen to e6, and he allowed this bishop to f6 move. This attacks the rook and also comes with an attack on the g5 pawn. We have rook to d7, and now bishop captures on g5, also threatening now to capture the f4 pawn, and now those pawns on the king side Grischuk have will start going up the board. And here bishop to c6 was played, and this is a very interesting move. Safarli offers the exchange of rooks, but that actually favors Grischuk. An interesting move here, although it's not a good move, but an interesting move would have been queen to e2. It's hard to say if Safarli considered this. For example, queen e2, you attack the rook on d1, rook protects rook, and now comes bishop captures on f3. You threaten checkmate on g2, and after rook captures on d7, simply king to c8, and now you're attacking the rook on d7 and also threatening checkmate on g2. But this actually doesn't work because simply rook to c2, and white is winning this. After we capture the rook, now comes knight e5 check. You force the king to move away from the rook. King has to go to for example, b6, and now we play knight captures on f3. There's no more checkmate threat on g2, and with a rook and two pieces for the queen, white is winning this. But you know, time trouble, it's hard to say if Safarli even considered this. So after bishop to g5, bishop to c6, and now it's Grischuk who's in the driving seat. Rook captures, bishop captures, and bishop captures on f4. And now Grischuk won 2 pawns. He has 3 passed pawns on the king side and also 2 connected pawns on the queen side. Probably if that a5 was played in that position, it would have been better. You know, it's not a good idea to have threats on both sides of the board. Bishop to a4. We have rook to e3, and here comes a series of moves that I really want you to concentrate on. Both players are in extreme time trouble. So rook to e3, queen to d7, the queen was attacked. We have bishop to e5, now not allowing the pawn to advance, as both bishop and rook are protecting c3 square. Bishop to c2, now comes bishop to c3, blocking. King to a6 and knight to e5. And this is this series of moves. I think it's 6 moves, and Grischuk played them instantly. So what's the idea here? You have a lot of you don't have a lot of time on the clock, and you have to figure out the exact position you want to have on the board and what are the ideal places for your pieces, or the ideal squares. Now you have here rook is protecting bishop on c3, also is protecting the knight. The bishop is protecting the knight here, and the knight and the bishop are creating a wall here, d4, d3, and d2, so the queen can never attack the rook on e3. So now Grischuk placed his pieces on ideal squares, and he doesn't have to worry, is there maybe a discovery on the piece or anything. He will next play king g1, king f2, protect the only unprotected piece on the board, and everything is fine for him. And another thing you have to consider, he placed all of these pieces on dark squares because Safarli has a light square bishop. So again, there is no move Safarli could make. Even if Grischuk had 1 second on the clock, he wouldn't have to even think about whether his piece will get attacked or anything. So a very useful maneuver to master. So queen to f5, now comes king g1. We have king king to b5 and king to f2. Now even the rook is protected, and there is really nothing black can do here. Queen goes to g5, now b3. Now Grischuk is preparing to start pushing his kingside pawns. Queen to f5, we have king g2, bishop to d3, and h4 now. Now the pawn is rushing up the board. Harry is going to win the game. King to a4, we have h5, king to b3. Now Safarli wants to kick that bishop away from c3 and start pushing his own past c-pawn. Bishop to d4, king to c2, we have h6, queen has to block the passed pawn, knight to g4, now defending the pawn, king d2, we have rook to d6, and rook to e6, sorry, and this was, endgame, there's still a queen on the board, but basically it's an endgame, and it was so intense. Every player in the playing hall was watching this game as it unfolded. Even Carlsen was standing next to the board watching it. Bishop to f5, first bishop to e3 check, we have king d3, and now knight to f2 check. Grischuk doesn't allow this knight to be traded. King to c2, now rook comes to c6, king b3, g4 now, and now the other pawn is coming up the board as well. Queen to d7, if pawn captures bishop, queen captures rook, but rook comes to a6. Bishop to b1, now black is ready to support his passed pawn down the board, but rook captures on a7 with a tempo on the queen. Queen e6, and now comes bishop to f4. c3, h7, now queen has to block the queening square. We have king to g3, also defending the bishop on f4, the queen was attacking it. Queen to h8 blocking, and now comes b5. And now there are threats on both sides of the board, there is nothing black can do here. Bishop captures on a h7 was played, but now comes b6, c2, b7 is here, and king to a2. There is really nothing to do here. Rook to a8 was played, now comes queen to a1. Here Safarli, as they are both very low on time, was hoping for b8 queen, so he could maybe do some damage with queen to g1 check, although not very likely. The king will simply escape, there is no problems here. But with a cool head, you know, really those are some steel nerves on Grischuk. He played king to g2, not allowing any ideas for black here. Still, if you promote the queen, bishop will simply capture it, and then he will promote his b pawn to his own queen. And in this position, Azerbaijani Grandmaster Safarli Eltaj resigned the game. So a wonderful game and a very refreshing one. I mean, it is a 71 move, but you know, that queen sacrifice was really something. So that was the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Both of them will be, of course, from the World Rapid Championship. Feel free to suggest any game from the World Rapid Championship. I will check all the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon.